And when you compose in the studio, do you often start with improvisation material, or not necessarily? Do you always start with something that's perhaps an hour's worth of material and then chop it up?
There's no always.
Right.
It's different depending on the context. And I also do a lot of work for other media like dance and film, and so there are other prerogatives involved. Yeah. So it depends very much on the starting point. Is not necessarily a sound starting point. It might be a text starting point, for example, or a image starting point.
I mean, that was my other question. Something like the middle of the moment film. What kind of, how does that change your strategy to compose music?
Well, there's two different aspects to what you're talking about. Because one is the music for the film itself, and the other is what happens if I decide to put out a soundtrack record. And those two aspects are really, for me, completely different, because effective film music needs the image as the image needs the music, and so they're indissolubly linked. When I do the soundtrack record, there's no image, and so it gives you the possibility to reinvent the music in a completely different way. So what I'm trying to do with a soundtrack record is trying to create a kind of a meta-narrative which will conjure up what the film was about without the film actually being there. When you're seeing the image, I mean, for example, one of the things from Middle of the Moment specifically that I was struggling with was that the directors wanted music where it wasn't, for me, necessary. And so, as a film composer, I like, first of all, to deal with the sound material that's actually in the film, which I think is what film composers have always done, except now it's become much more kind of normal to talk about sound design. But sound design, you know, started with Citizen Kane pretty much, so, if not earlier, so it's not something which is particularly new. But there was one scene in the Middle of the Moment where the Tuareg are going across the desert with their mules and camels and harness and everything else, and they wanted kind of travelogue music to go with it, and I basically refused to do it and said, if you want to have music for that scene, the best thing you could possibly do is turn up the volume. And to their credit, that's what they did. And so when you see the film, you hear a very exaggerated sound of the things going through the desert, and it creates a rhythm track that I could not even have approached in its complexity, and which is actually the sound of the thing. So it's a much more organic relationship than me trying to make nice travel music.
I mean, how involved were you in storyboarding at that level? Did you come at the end? No. Is that typical of other film projects?
I think film composers are always the last people to do anything, pretty much. Except what usually happens is you do something and then the directors or the producers change their mind about something, and so all the work you put into it gets thrown out after the fact. But you're usually coming in when there's no budget left and there's only 3 days to do it in it. You know, so it's a challenge always.
Can we jump to the early 90s and talk a little bit about Naked City? I'm interested in how the band works as a, you know, somehow conceptual rock band, having you as perhaps the only person who actually came from a rock background in the band. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. That's why I was there.
Oh, is that why?
I had a unique skill set, which was the fact that I was primarily a rock musician, but that I could also read music very well. Right. And the two things don't usually go together, so I was the right person at the right time for that job. And he wanted rock credibility because everybody else was coming from a jazz background, and he wanted to really explore the rock stuff. So I gave them a little bit more edge than they would have had.
So was the music devised in a way that rock bands typically devise music? Was the music written down? Was it graph notation?
It varied. The Naked City worked in the following way. There were 4 categories of music, which we'll call A, B, C, and D because that's what they were called, in fact. Category A, let's see if I can remember this. Category A was very short pieces that John composed. Category B was longer pieces that John composed. Category C was longer pieces that other people composed. And category D was arrangements of things from the classical repertoire. And they were numbered. And so at a typical Naked City concert, before the concert we would sit in the dressing room and John would basically say, okay, here's the order for tonight, A32, A35, B36. You know. We would be pulling out the music and putting it in order and go on stage and do it. We would not practice beforehand. And in fact the way the group began, we had no repertoire and no rehearsal until the day of the first concert. And we arrived at the Knitting Factory at 2 in the afternoon, And in time for the first concert, we had managed to learn about 15 pieces. And so we did the 15 pieces, and we had 4 nights, and we just assumed that the next night we were going to do the same pieces again and get them better, but the second day we did 15 more pieces. And at the end of the 4 days we had 60 pieces, and that was the basic repertoire, and from that we built until we ended up with about 300, I think. And so it was a process. We never ever did a Naked City concert where there wasn't new material added.
And how do you compare that changing performance practice with the recordings and also on the CD? Because it does. All the CDs sound, incredibly composed and fixed.
Well, it was, and we didn't. Basically, the recording was mostly live.
You recorded privately?
It was pretty much live with a few solos added afterwards.
Yeah.
And the way of writing varied, to go back to the beginning of your question. Obviously, the classical arrangements were classical arrangements with notation and everything. And there were other things which were more kind of like film music arrangements, where it was more like a jazz chart with chords and approximate bass pedal figures and so on. And the cut-up pieces, the kind of notorious short pieces, were very much a mixture. So there would be on one page of a piece that lasted about 30 seconds, maybe 15 sections, some of which would be a notated bar followed by an instruction to the drummer to play like this drummer or that drummer or this style of music for 3 beats, and then this style of music for the next 4 beats. And so there were verbal instructions mixed with notation, and it was very much kind of like it sounds, a series of cut-ups and edits which we then had to kind of negotiate. And it was a matter of being very fluent readers in order to make it work, because we were basically reading it the first time we did it.
Right. Tonight you're going to play Chris Cutler. This is kind of a long-standing duo.
35 years.
Is that right?
Yeah.
What changes? I mean, I guess you go back to playing together, and I guess there'll be months that you don't play together, and then you go back and you play in different contexts with other people. What changes when you basically? I mean, most of your sets will be fully improvised.
All of it.
What changes over this period of time?
It's funny because we never seem to play the same way twice, and we don't play often enough to get into any habits.
Right.
And this time it will actually be hard on the heels. We just played in Russia. We played in Moscow and St. Petersburg 3 days ago. So we're coming off 2 consecutive concerts, which is unusual. So perhaps today was going to be a hopeless failure because of that. I don't know.
Well, I look forward to that.
We're looking forward to that.